Parents of Reddit, what is the creepiest most frightening thing one of your kids has said to you? My sons were about 2 and 4 when their pet goldfish died. I attempted to use the situation as an opportunity to discuss death and mortality. After I finished my explanation, my 4-year-old looked up at me with his big, blue eyes and asked, "Mommy, someday, will you die?" My heart filled with love and a little sadness, knowing this was one of those pivotal moments when the first bit of childhood innocence was lost, and I told him yes, someday, mommy will die. Good, he said with a totally deadpan expression and walked out of the room. Later, when we were about to flush the fish, he asked if we could eat him instead. I said no, we don't eat pets because we love them, and he said, when you die, I'm going to eat you. My daughter was only around 18 months old when she uttered her first full sentence. She loved to lift the air conditioning grate in the floor of our bedroom and stuff her toys down there. Well, there were some sharp edges in there, so my wife didn't want her sticking her hand in the duct, so she screwed down the edges of the grate so our daughter couldn't lift it up any longer. Well, my daughter has this plastic toy hammer and she's trying to get it into the vent, but it won't come up. So she takes the hammer, pounds on the grate some, nada. Then she tries to pry the grate up, no go. At this point, my wife and I kind of chuckled and our daughter heard us. So she glares with this furious look on her face, throws the hammer at the wall and almost shouts, "I don't have to take this shit anymore." My 2-year-old said there is a fairy in his room. He points to the corner with the aircon. He says it most nights. One day I was showing him some old family photos. I show him one of my mother and he points to it and says fairy bedroom. The photo was of my mum as a girl. She died 4 years ago. My kid was in the bathtub one night with the bathroom door open and I was puttering around in the next room. She called out and said, "Hey mommy, who was that blue guy who just walked down the hall?" She said he was tall and thin and featureless like the shape of those men on the bathroom door like at a restaurant. Creeped me out. When my father was a kid in the 60s, he would go into the living room in the middle of the night, turn the TV on to static, climb on his rocking horse, and slowly rock back and forth in the dark room, only lit by the TV static, and slowly say, "I hate mommy. I hate mommy. I hate mommy." Over and over again. My grandmother says it was the creepiest thing she's ever seen. Well, that and the UFO. I don't have kids, but apparently this happened when I was about 4. I shared a room with my older sister, and we had huge closets in our bedroom that were about 6 foot tall. My mother would wake up in the middle of the night to hear me crying and she'd come in to investigate what was wrong. She then would find me sitting on top of the 6 closest, cross-legged and rocking back and forth while crying about, "The big scary man put me up here." Since my mother was tired from it being the middle of the night and being heavily pregnant, she didn't really think about how I got up on the closet, but would put me back into bed and comfort me until I fell asleep again. But then my grandmother came to stay with us a few nights and she told my mother that she woke up in the middle of the night because it got suddenly cold and her bedroom door handle was turning. The door opened, but no one was there, and then the bathroom door opposite her door opened on its own. She stared out the door for a few minutes not moving because she was in shock and frightened, but then heard me start crying. My mother walked by her room to get to me and of course I was crying about the man putting me up there. My grandmother told my mum what she experienced and my sister slept with my gran and I slept with mum for the next couple of weeks after that. It stopped once my brother was born and to this day I have no idea what really happened. I'm not a parent, but my mom told me that when I was really young, I used to sit by the rocking chair and mumble things. She eventually became curious and asked what I was saying. I told her I was talking to the old lady. Also, about 10 years later, I stayed at my aunt's house. In the morning, I heard my 3-year-old cousin stirring, so I decided to be a thoughtful niece and went to get her out of bed so my aunt could sleep in longer. When I walked into her room, she stood up in her crib and said, "Your friend came and woke me up last night." I was staying in a room by myself the night before. I used to have night terrors when I was around 2. Vivid nightmares that involved walking and talking in my sleep. Consequently, I often spent the night in my parents' bed. One time my mom woke up and saw that I was missing. She found me standing in the living room. She tried to pick me up, but I backed away and screamed, "Wash the blood off your hands." It creeped her the fuck out. When I was about 4, I thought I was the best musician ever. My grandmother had this really old, out-of-tune piano at her house. Any day my family and I were there for a visit and I sat myself down at the old piano and started playing. To my ears, it was the most beautiful, heart-wrenching and moving piece ever to grace human ears. To everyone else it must have sounded like an ogre playing an organ. My older sister walked over to me and asked what song I was playing. I stopped and without looking up replied, "It's called Pretty Lady Go Away," and I started playing again and she slowly walked away. My son was 3 when I was tucking him into bed one night and he said, "Mommy, what's that big thing?" I replied, "What thing, baby?" Then he said, "That big thing right behind you." I knew there was nothing right behind me but a wall. I just did the scumbag mom thing and backed out of the room and shut the door. He wasn't scared of that big thing. I was the kid. My mom told me this story once I was older. My great-grandfather died and because I was so young no one told me. My mom took me to his grave a few weeks after it happened and let me play amongst the gravestones while she lay flowers. As we were leaving, I stopped and asked, "Why is great-grandpa sitting in the tree?" I then pointed to what appeared to my mom as an empty tree and waved. The tree was planted so the branches hung right above where he was buried. TLDR. Pointed out my great-grandfather to my mother without knowing he had died. When my nephew was 3 or 4, he would stare at the window in my parents' kitchen. One day, my mom asked him what he was looking at, and he said, "When I lived here before, my name was Alphonse, and I was bigger than you." My mom was slightly creeped out and eventually told my stepdad. My stepdad just kind of blinked and said, that was my grandfather's name, but we don't talk about him. I never liked that house anyway. Apparently I was born a troll. For the first 2-3 months of my life I used not to react to my mother in any way. Whenever she talked to me, I would not turn my head. When she touched me or called for my attention, I would not look. My mother thought I was both blind and deaf, and she worried a lot about my future life. She went to a nurse to get me checked, and there I suddenly acted like a well-behaved baby, and everything seemed fine. Then when we got home I would simply continue my ignoring. According to her story, one day I stopped being an asshole baby and started reacting normally. A story of when my brother was younger that my parents often tell. My dad and my granddad went to an old army base that was now used as a museum. As they went into a bunker, my brother started saying, "This is where we hid from the monsters that went boom boom boom." My dad thought it was a bit strange but kept on looking around. A low-flying plane flew by and my brother said, "That is the monster there." As he was pointing to the plane. My brother was 2 at the time, which must have been in 1994. Needless to say, both my dad and my granddad were creeped out by it and still are today. While playing classroom with my 3-year-old brother, he made an offhanded comment about being in my mother's belly twice. I was amused and said, "Oh really?" He proceeded to tell me in amazing detail being inside our mother. He told me about it being warm and that he liked it, but he always felt sick. One day he got so sick that they came and told him he had to leave. He didn't want to, so they promised him he would get to came back again and back to our mom. So he left and they let him come back again, and this time he didn't feel sick. I lost my mind and started screaming for my mother. He told her the same story. Then after she stopped crying we were not allowed to talk about it. I was 10 and I was old enough to remember that she had a miscarriage almost 1 year before my brother was born. Side note, I'm not religious, but my brother always kinda makes me wonder. My mom told me this story about a year ago. She took me hiking a lot as a kid and we usually went to interesting historical areas. We were at a place called Riding on Stone and we were walking along a stone wall with carvings on it and we were next to flat prairie. Apparently I told my mom over and over about this native man that was standing in the field. She asked me where he was and when I went to show her, I was pointing at nothing. She said it scared the crap out of her. When I was pregnant with my first, a 5-year-old came up to me and said, "All babies are born alone." He mom and I share freaked out glances and then she awkwardly tried to fix the situation by talking about twins. My oldest, 6, 5 at the time, once got mad at my youngest, 3, 2 at the time, for sitting in the doorway to their room. Instead of asking him to move or calling for me, my eldest grabbed the little one by his head and shook him as hard as he could. I freaked out, scooped up the toddler and yelled, "What's the matter with you? You can't shake babies. Do you know that could kill him?" Without flinching, my oldest looked me in the eyes and said, "Yes, that's what I was trying to do." I lost my mind and called up his therapist, wondering if I needed to or could commit him. It was really scary. To clarify, he had a tendency to react physically, but before that I never thought he was actually trying to hurt anyone. A little late, but I have a good one. When my oldest brother was 3 or 4, he fell into my cousin's pool. The pool didn't have a ladder and was several inches to reach to get out. No way for a 3-year-old that has ever swam in his life to escape. Well, while all the adults were talking they hear him screaming and splashing, and then silence. When they ran to get him, he was standing right next to the pool, and he was soaking wet. When they asked him what happened, he said, "I fell in the pool and couldn't get out, then a shiny man pulled me out." My 3-year-old niece was in the backseat and she, my mother, and I were on the way to take my niece to her first movie, a matinee of a Disney movie that had been out a while, so we figured there wouldn't be many people there in case she wouldn't be quiet. Then we come to a load of traffic at a dead stop and my mother says, "Oh God, look at this traffic." And from the backseat comes my niece's tiny 3-year-old voice, "God can't help you." I turned and looked at my mother and she stopped and looked at me and then we both turned and looked back at my niece and my niece just stares at both of us for a second and then lets out this really evil little cackle that turns into a hysterical laugh. It was very surreal at the time. When my cousin was around 12 or so, she's almost 30, we were sitting around the table eating dinner and she very quietly left the table to rummage through her room, followed by her brother's room across the hallway. After about 15 minutes she comes back empty-handed, cleans her area and proceeds to sit in front of the TV. Her mother and brother asked what she was looking for. She replied, "A man just asked for a blanket because he's cold. I couldn't find an extra one to give to him." We entertained it and asked what he looked like. She gave a random description of an older man with a scruffy beard, brown shirt and dirty jeans. At that age we just chalked it up as imagination and left her alone. About an hour later the doorbell rings and my aunt answers it. She returns a few seconds later clearly shaken up and says, "There's a homeless man asking for a spare blanket." He's the man she was talking about. We all go to the door with my aunt to give him the blanket to see the scruffy homeless man in a dirty brown shirt and jeans. He politely takes the blanket, thanks her and leaves. My cousin states that was the man she was trying to help earlier. Shit freaked me out for years.